For those of you who have already been through timeline 6, this will look familiar to you, but there is a brand new UI. That's one of the main topics, right? And so this UI comes out of a pretty extensive user experience study that we went through with a number of key clients, where we analyzed the number of clicks, the typical paths that folks would go through when they're using timeline to get to the most commonly used areas of the tool. All right, so what you're going to see is, from a navigation perspective, the menus are collapsed now. So you get to your analytical tools here by this drop down towards the top left. Not all of the tools, however, are grouped here because we have some of the filtering tools on the right. The menus, for example, your metrics are now collapsible. So we're trying to make more efficient use of the screen and the space available. And you can obviously pin this out if you're interested. So that type of navigation is obviously new. You also see on screen the process view, right? And so this is a brand new page with the accompanying dashboard here to the right. And so within this process view, there's obviously two panes here, but I want to start by focusing on the primary path view. So I call this, it's akin to a variant explorer of sorts, if you've seen in other type of process mining tools or demos, where you can iterate through the different possible process variations and add more complexity to this schema model as you go. So you can see right now, I'm accounting for the top 8 different possible process execution patterns or behaviors out of 87 relative to this insurance auto claims workflow. And as I expand out for more, and if you're familiar with the path analysis, you're essentially adding extra paths to this schema representation as you go. Now, what you should also notice is, as I iterate through and add more timelines or paths in scope, the metrics on the right are dynamically scoping to allow for new data, right, that I'm bringing into focus by adding new paths. So this allows you to, in a sense, trend your metrics, which we'll get to here in the right, related to process behavior. As you add process variation, we'll see how many timelines we account for, what's the time range, the first and last. And so, of course, this view over here to the right is fully customizable, and we'll talk about exactly how that's done. But right now, I'm sorted based on the 11 most common pathways based on volume, the count of timelines. We can change that. So I can look at that those timelines paths that are taking us the longest. I can resort based on ascending or descending. So you have some options here as to how you'd like to view the process sequencing and including or excluding variance from the analysis. Now, also within this primary path view, you have the ability to switch over to the milestone view. And this is going to be what most timeline users are familiar with as just our schema analytical tool. You can create your custom schema with the events that you're most interested in analyzing for. Right, so I can use any of my predefined, I can create a new one, and I can do all the typical analysis you would come to expect with our schema tool, where we can look at throughput visualized, look at volume, the location of specific steps as a percentage of where they typically exist, and so on. Right, so nothing has necessarily changed there. It's just basically found a new home here in this process view state screen. Now, as I mentioned, to the right, and what you see here is when I switched over to the milestone view, now I, by default, have all data within focus, right? And so this is two ways dynamic, in the sense that if I want to click on a specific value in a chart here on the right that I've created, I can select Carrie Ann McDonough. That automatically sets a filter so that all of my charts, as well as this schema view, is now representing the cases that Carrie Ann McDonough was responsible for, right? And so just that one-click filter action is, I think, very useful. And then I can reset my selection and maybe run a quick visual comparison against another value if I want to look at Jim Ricks, for example, and focus in on the claims he's been responsible for. You see, kind of interesting, right? It's quite a slower progression for the claims that Jim's been working on versus the ones that I saw going through when I clicked on Carrie Ann's name. Okay. So this gives us that dynamic aspect between the chart as well as the chart and the schema representation. Now, these, as I mentioned, charts here on the right are all customizable. You can add new tiles. We can edit charts and tiles, much as you would in the dashboard editor previously with Timeline. And so how I see these being utilized is really as persona-based landing pages. Right. So if you have a user, you want to give access to Timeline and they have a specific remit of analysis they're looking to do or metrics that you understand that they care about, you can customize these charts to fit their needs, right? And you can add new boards. So you can have different landing pages for different roles. For example, you have a compliance role, you have an executive, you have an analyst or a line of business owner. Each of those could have their own specific and pointed view when they come here into this board, into the landing page in the dashboard. Okay. So moving on from then the process view, we're going to look at simulation. That's the other new big change here in Timeline 6. So what simulation allows us to do is modify certain variables to account for a possible end state and see what the results of changes to our process may be. And I'm going to walk you through exactly what type of variables we can modify. So we start with a schema, and you can choose any schema you've created within the project. And you can create multiple simulations, and you'll see that we'll do a comparison simulation versus simulation to compare results. So you create the schema. Okay. And one of the keys here is that we're using your actual process history, lifecycle data. If you've ever worked with simulation tools in the past, there's a pretty extensive process discovery effort that goes on to get to this schema representation. It's manual. It's typically not fully complete, and at worst, it's just incorrect. In this case, we're allowing Timeline to do the work here and just, hey, this is what our schema looks like. We know this based on the data we've loaded. Let's start with this as our baseline, right, as our initial understanding. And that's very important to start from a reliable and known schema model. Now, once we do that, we can then choose, okay, we're going to simulate or build what I call synthetic timelines and put them through this simulated model once we're done. And we can choose how many we'd like to run the simulation on. So in this project, I've got 32,000 historical data. So let's just say we'll do 32,000. Next, we can add resources, all right? And so we can add those manually or take them from our data files. In this scenario, I've got a couple of resources within my data, and so I can have the tool mine those out automatically for me. In this case, this is going to be my people. My people are my resources, but it could be technology. There could be other assets that you would assign as resources here. This is going to be kind of around an automation type scenario. So we're trying to automate that manual work that humans might be doing. So my people are my adjusters and my agents. So I've mapped to those. What it's going to do is going to mine those resources, and it's going to tell you how many I have available. Right. So this is within my data set. I've got 18 adjusters and agents and 17 agents respectively. And I can modify this. So I can simulate for either bumping up the availability of those resources or scaling down. In the case of automation, I probably would drop that down. So actually, let's go to the agents. And let's say I want to take a look at what would our results look like if I went from 17 to 6 agents instead. And you'll see where we make this distinction within the analysis itself. Okay, so we're removing humans from the process. Now, let's focus in on a single step. Or let's mine our behavior. And this is going to give us the statistics. So this is going to show you, okay, based on this schema model, here are the percentage of cases that go one way versus another, the amount of time it takes to go from one case to another. And so again, based on our historical data, here are our baselines. All right, so what can we modify as it pertains to that future end state? One, We've done our resource. We've dropped from 18 or 17 agents down to 6 agents. Now I'm going to go to this processor assign step, and we do these variable changes on a step-by-step basis. So I'm going to be very specific about what's happening and where. So I'm going to assign a resource here. My agents are my processors. So they would be assigned at this stage. With these histograms are showing us are the amount of time that it takes to go from any upstream step. We call these fork distributions. So coming from coverage confirmed, here's the distribution of time it takes to get to this processor assigned step. Coming from reserves established, here's what we have accordingly. Okay, so we have 2 steps feeding into here. And what I can do is I can modify the amount of time it takes us to do this step, right? To go either from an upstream step to processor assigned, or from processor assigned downstream to any other step. All right, so that's the second variable, is time. How long does it take us to do this step? So I can do that here in my histogram by saying, I really want to shorten the time it takes us. So we're going to remove the tail. We're going to say, when we go into reserves established, it can only go up to 11 hours. That's one way I can do that, shortening the time. I can also say, I just want to drop 40% of the time that it takes, just holistically. So I can say, this is going to be 0.6. So we're going to use a 0.6 multiplier, taking away 40% of the time in every time we go to fraud check. Okay, so you have multiple options of how you do that. Now, the third option we have, or variable we have to be able to modify, is how often we go from one stage to another. So the pattern or sequence of behavior. So we can see our percentages here. When we go from processor assigned to reserves established, 17% of the time. Let's play around with a few of these. So let's say this, we go down to 30. Okay, this goes up to 60. And this would only happen 10% of the time. Okay, so now we're changing the amount of times that we go from one step to another. Right, so third variable. First was resource availability. Second was the amount of time it takes to go from any one stage to another. And then third is how often do we do one step versus another, right? Changing this forking distribution. Now, once we've made those changes, we can then close. And again, we can do this at every process step. So you can get very specific as to what that looks like. We would then run our simulation. So I'm going to take you through to 1 or 2 simulations that I've already run against, and we would look at the results, right? And what you can do now is result. And so what I really focused on here was, what is the optimal resource allocation from an agent perspective, where I'm going to have the least amount of waiting time, right? And cases are going to get pushed through expeditiously. So I built a simulation with 2 agents, 15 agents, and 10 agents. And you see, as a result, you can compare what high-level metrics look like. So the overall processing time, minimum, maximum, average, total. We can look at costs, right? We can look at it at a step basis. Now, again, I focused really on this processor assigned step. So how many cases went to there? What was the min, max, average? How much cost was incurred for each specific scenario? And then we can also look at, if you're familiar with bottleneck, how the bottleneck view, so going from one step to another, as well as the amount of time that resources are spending. So in this case, we've got, when we have 2 agents, our waiting time average is 2 years. So that's probably not the right number, right? That's gone up considerably versus the ones around it. When we've got 15 agents, it's 6 months. When we've got 10 agents, it's 7 months. So you're looking somewhere around this 10 number, probably to be your optimal use based on the criteria that I imported. Some level of automation, we're doing steps less frequently, they're happening more quickly, etc. Okay. So I realize I'm at time here. We're 15 minutes in. So I can open it up now if there are any questions out there. Or maybe I can open up the chat on my own and take a look.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions in the chat that is visible for everyone. And after that, I have a couple of questions sent to hosts, to panelists only.
Okay.
So we could start from the chat.
All right, I'm looking through it right now. So number of resources based on the parameters selected, timeline count or date. So that number of resources is based on all data in the project. So it is not time bound based on a specific time segment. However, as you saw, I can always manually, that's when I mine that from my data set. I can always manually modify that, right? But it is not bound based on time. It's bound based on all data. Is it possible to get access to the metrics and how they were built for the demo project? Yeah, so this is a public project. I think the question is, can you get access to the metrics and the metric configuration? We don't give access to that for all users, otherwise it would just become a mess in here. That's why it's locked down. But if you're familiar with how you've built charts and metrics in the past, that's how they were done, right? So you first go in, you create some metric or aggregation that you'd like to create for, right? So here's the metric creation, right? So let's just say new. I want to base it on all timelines or any specific set. And then I choose the metric aggregation type that I'd like, right, from this list. So just say count of events, all timelines, right? And we'll just create our metric, okay? Next, we would then go and create a chart based off that metric. So how do you want to visualize, or you could obviously use any of the predefined charts that you have in your project, but I'll create a new one. We'll say, I want to source it based off a metric. We'll just make it very simple. Here's my new metric, and here's a count, right? And then I would say count. How you want to display it. Obviously, there's many other options if you choose different chart types to be able to display that. Let me save it. And then from there, I would add a new tile to my board. And that new tile is going to use my new count. Save it. And there you have it. Not sure why the preview is not available. Oh, there it is. So that's the mechanism, right? And quite honestly, in looking at how these metrics were made within this project, probably wouldn't be overly useful. They're just there for example's sake. So hopefully that helps. Is there a way to get past 50 limit to primary pass? No, there is not. And the reason that is that is the same kind of limitation with the path analysis. Is we kind of made that distinction that if you go past 50, you're getting your very low frequency types of cases, and that would kind of obscure the analysis. Obviously, that data isn't contained in all the metrics and other charts, but as far as a visualization, we stop at 50. Accounting for resource dependencies that can inject wait times. So, I mean, that's really done at this step level when, for example, so if the question is around resource dependencies. And so that's done if you saw, let me go back to the simulation I was working on. I assigned a resource here, right, at agent. I could also assign an agent if I wanted to at any other given step. And so that's going to make that resource dependent in multiple areas of the process. And that's obviously then going to constrain the amount of processing power that resource has, right? Because they would have to be able to process here as well as here. And so you would see those wait times fluctuate based on their availability. Multipliers work. So yeah, multipliers are basically in just saying that I want to simulate a future state where we go from processor assigned to fraud check, for example, 40% more quickly. Let's say we're going to automate this fraud check step. And as soon as it leaves the processor assigned, it's going to get picked up by an automation, and it's going to run that. So that's just going to happen more quickly as opposed to a person having to process that, go through the manual fraud check process. That's going to take more time for them to get through that stage. And so we'll say, hey, 40% of our cases, we're going to shoot for automation here. So in our future state, this is going to be done 60% as fast. So it's going to multiply all the times in that simulated scenarios by 0.6, right, that it would have previously taken to do that step. And that's going to simulate it happening 40% more quickly. So that's a blanket way of doing it. And then, as I said, distribution here, the histogram, you can say it'll never take us in our future state more than 12 hours. We're going to reduce that to that level. And so it'll work, and our simulation will work within those bounds. Would it be possible to have resource count based with parameters? So yeah, that's a good enhancement request, right? To say, give me all the resources from a specific time range. At this point, it doesn't exist. So I would recommend putting that one in as a request through the support portal. That makes sense. Right now, the mechanism would be to go back here and either first and foremost, just do it manually if you kind of have a ballpark for how many you have, or mine the resource from the data, see how many are in there, and manually update it based on your knowledge. Okay, that's all the answers or all the questions that I see in the chat for now. So if there are others, feel free to put them in there. Or Elena, if you had others.
While we are waiting for, if we have other questions, I'll just add a few words about the process that after the end of this webinar, we will definitely send all of you the recording of this session and the link to the survey with only one question. If you want to offer some topic for our future ABBYY University webinars, we would really appreciate if you provide us your ideas about what do you want to see. And I still don't see any new questions. Oh, ETL.
ETL, I mean, the navigation to ETL has changed, right? It lives here underneath the data, but I don't believe anything will look any different. So it's just the way we segment ETL versus a project is accessed versus that part. So all the operations and the UI about ETL that you've expected is all there. Now there will be changes coming to this, but in this 6.0 release, not yet. Okay.
So we still have 5 minutes booked of access to Alex. So please feel free to ask your questions about changes in timeline.
ETL has a plan to add formulas. So you can tell me if I'm not answering this correctly. When I think of formulas, I think of some level of scripting language. I mean, we can do case statements within ETL. At this point, there are no plans that I know of to add scripting into our ETL. Like we're keeping ETL to be UI specific, right? So that I mean, the idea being that you don't have to be able to write script to be able to work within that. So we want, if there are specific functions that you see, you could just inject a couple variables into the UI, then I think the ask would be, please let us know what you think could enhance from a function perspective. But as far as opening up to formulas and scripting, I do not think that that's in the cards at this point. But that list of operations that you saw, that you know of in when you add an operation, this should always be growing, right? So my ask would be, hey, if you have specific functions that you think are going to be useful, let us know. Put it in there. As I mentioned, if you put it in through a support request, it'll get to our product manager, and they'll review those, and we should be adding to that continuously. For ETL, is it possible to support regular expressions for file name and the manifest as opposed to hard coding the name? I don't, but we would have to check on that one for you. That's probably a good question for support, if I'm honest with you. I don't know the specifics of adding variables and things like that into the file name. And it is specific to the manifest file. So unfortunately, I don't have an answer for that one for you. I would check with support on that one. Does ETL still have separate repositories by project? I wouldn't say ETL has repositories by project. ETL has repositories by user. So for example, my user gets a repository, and then I can create multiple, or excuse me, it's almost like like if you think about it like a database, and databases within that, and then the tables are obviously the tables within the database. So you can certainly create your ETL repositories by project, but there's no requirement that it does that, right? You could put all your files into one ETL repository if you see fit. You can segment it out by project. It really just depends how you'd like to delineate your data sets, because you could, in theory, point a single file, right, to multiple different projects. So I could have this hospital transfer file go out to 2, 3, 4 different, and the example there is maybe I have a single file that has multiple case identifiers with just different perspectives. So in the hospital scenario, for example, you have like an emergency department use case, and you have a file related to emergency departments. In one sequence, you're looking at this based on the patient ID, right? So I'm tracking the life cycle of my patients as they flow through the emergency room. Maybe I have a separate ID in there that's the doctor ID, and I want to push that same file out to a second project, right? It's the same exact series of operations, same exact data, except I want to push this data now using my doctor ID as my case identifier. Now my project has a very different perspective. I'm looking at the doctor's life cycle throughout the day, right? In one case, I'm watching the patient as they arrive, when they leave. And then in another case, I'm watching the doctor when they clock in the morning or the afternoon, whenever they come in, until the end of their shift and all the interactions that they would do. So that's a long way of saying it really is up to you how you delineate your repositories and your data. It doesn't have to be by project.